Hello, David.
Hi, Chris. Nice to talk to you.
Yeah, likewise. We're here today because I've just read your book, your latest book, which is this one here, Narco Ball, Love, Death and Football in Escobar's Colombia. It was a very good read, very compelling read. And we'll talk about it for the bulk of this interview. But to start off, and I say it's with all my guests, just a bit about yourself, who you are, and basically why you decided to write about this particular subject.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, my name's David Arrowsmith. I am 44-year-old full-time author living down in Hove in Sussex on the south coast of the UK. I left a 20 plus year career in documentary filmmaking last year to write this book, Narco Ball, and start a career as a full-time professional writer. Um, And this idea, really, this story about the history of Colombian football and the influence that the Colombian narcos, and in particular Pablo Escobar, had on the fame and fortune and trials and tribulations of Colombian domestic and national football, particularly in the 80s and early 90s. Was a story that I've been thinking about for quite a few years. And the reason I, in particular, was thinking about it really is I'm half Colombian myself. My mum is Colombian. She was born in Medellin and raised in Bogota. And I have a half brother and half sister who are both Colombian and came to the UK with my mum before I was born. So I grew up as a sort of half Colombian, half British young man, boy, born in London, but with a very patriotic Colombian mum. And I was taken by her. I think my very first football match, I went to Wembley to see Colombia against England in 1988 in the Rouse Cup. And my mum, being my mum and very patriotic and Colombian, bought us tickets in the away fan section. So I sat right up in the gods in old Wembley with all the Colombian fans watching the team that had Carlos Valderrama, Rene Higuita, and in fact Andres Escobar playing in it. And that was kind of my introduction to Colombian football, to I guess the kind of to being outwardly, vocally patriotic about Colombia and supporting them. And I followed them ever since and watched them in the 1990 World Cup on the telly and in USA 94 on the telly. And I think this book, in some ways, is kind of me trying to come to terms with what happened at USA 94, really. Um, Trying to understand how Colombia went from being one of the potential winners of the tournament to going out in the first round in the group stages, and how that led to the assassination of Andres Escobar, and how everything basically that happened with Pablo and the cartels led to that moment, and the impact that had on Colombia as a country, its psyche, and its fans and lovers of football, and how the country was perceived internationally as well. And then the other thing that inspired the book was reading more about the 1989 Copa Libertadores campaign. That was the first time that a Colombian club team had ever won the Copa Libertadores, which, if viewers aren't or listeners aren't familiar with it, is the South America's equivalent really to the Champions League, all the best club sides in South America competing. And Colombia had never won it until 1989. And in 1989, they did win it. Team Atlético Nacional from Medellin won the tournament, which was a huge moment for Colombian football, but I think has always been overshadowed by the spectre of Pablo Escobar. He was the power behind that side. He invested a lot of money in that team, but he also had other ways to influence results and the success of that side. And so it's always been a bit under a cloud, that moment, and I wanted to explore that as well.
There have been many books and many documentaries written about Pablo Escobar, so I'm not going to retread over old ground. But in relation to the football, how big a role did that sport play in Pablo's life growing up?
I think that's what I found really interesting when I was preparing to write, researching, and then writing this book, is that there's been so much about Pablo, as you say, everything from Narcos on Netflix to all kinds of books written by his wife, his son, those that worked for him, those that hunted him down and helped bring him to some sort of justice. And all of them mention his interest in football, but none of them made it the focus, and none of them really told the story of how that interest in football led to his influence over the game in Colombia and the impact that had even on the global stage. So I found it really interesting to draw all of that out. And as you look at all of those sources, you see how his interest in football and love of football started at a very young age. He grew up on the streets of Medellin with his older brother Roberto, kicking around a plastic bag filled with old rags and clothes on the dusty streets. Couldn't afford a football, but could make a ball. Had it confiscated by the police, got in trouble. I think he grew up loving football. I think perhaps even fancying himself as not a bad little player. I think he used to play on the right wing and cut in on his left foot. And I think he always loved the game. And then as he got older, the game became something that I think he felt he could use to get support, to get love, to get power and influence. And in particular, I think there came a moment where he had a dream, I think, of politics and perhaps even one day becoming president of Colombia. And he started to build that strategy, and he was elected a suplente in Colombia's parliament, which is a kind of stand-in MP effectively. And when his dream of politics was kind of taken away, when the politicians started to say, hey, who is this guy? Where's his money coming from? He's a narco. We can't have him here. And he was kind of basically kicked out, and he kind of left politics for good. I think that's when football became even more important to him as a replacement, as something that he could use to win the hearts and minds of the people, to get power and influence, and so much power and influence that he might be protected from punishment, from extradition, from being prosecuted. So I think he grew up loving football, and then I think football then became something further down the line that became something a bit different for him.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but from what I remember reading in a book, he bought a lot of land and built pitches on those. Is that correct? And is it true that a lot of the players, like you watched at that game at Wembley, actually started playing football on those fields?
That's right. I mean, the complicated thing about him is that for whatever reason, for whatever motivation, whether it was selfish or otherwise, whether it was kind of cynical and clinical, or whether it was in any way sort of emotionally genuine, he did do a lot of things that it's hard to argue against as being good things in Colombia, especially in Medellin. He really focused his attention, and it was for political benefit in many ways, but he focused his attention on a group of people that the authorities really were ignoring, and the rich and powerful in Bogota were ignoring, which was the poor, and the poor of the slums of Medellin. And he brought them healthcare, he brought them schools, he brought them electricity. But one of the things that I think he got the most love for was bringing them football. And as you say, he had pitches built, he had stands built, he brought floodlights, he supplied kit and equipment. And so in those barrios, in those slums, he became the guy who brought the community together to these great football matches where the community would come and watch, and he would often ceremonially open the pitches and open the games and do the kickoff. And I think there was a lot of love and support for him, especially in those early days when he did bring a lot to the poor. He did use a lot of his wealth and the influence and the manpower that he had to do that. And a lot of those young players who came through the ranks, especially at the Medellin sides, Atlético Nacional and Deportivo Independiente Medellin, they did. They grew up playing on those pitches. They were identified by those scouts that were often, funded by money that Pablo was putting into those clubs and brought into those teams. And some of them became, almost his friends because they knew what he'd done for their community. and for their opportunity as footballers. So he's a complex character, and I was nervous about making him out to be a hero. But he definitely played to that. He wanted to be seen as a champion of people, of his people, and bringing football to them was a crucial part of that.
Wasn't he, from what you described, was he like a Robin Hood character in many respects, although how he acquired the money was illegal?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that he reveled in that. I think it was one of the main Colombian publications. I think it was Semana from memory, which is a magazine, a big magazine in Colombia, did a big piece on him and called him the Paisa Robin Hood, the sort of Medellin country Robin Hood, basically. And I think he loved that idea that he was going up against the rich and the powerful, maybe not literally robbing from them in the way that Robin Hood sort of had done, but that he stood against the traditional blue-blooded rich and powerful on the side of the poor, and that he was generous and sort of benevolent and helpful to the poor. And he himself grew up, far from wealthy. He was pretty working class at best, really. So yeah, he loved that idea. The flip side of that is that, like you say, the money that he was making was from highly illegal activity, highly exploitative activity, and he might have been giving, jobs and money and opportunity to young people, but those jobs were to carry guns, to traffic drugs, to kill people, to intimidate people, to bribe people. So it's difficult, but when you've got such a disparity in wealth and such a large proportion of a population that are in poverty and are struggling, then what he offered, was life-changing, I guess, to a lot of them.
At national level, with national team and at club level, what was the state of Colombian football before Pablo Escobar got involved with Atlético Nacional?
I think it wasn't great. I think so. In the 70s, Colombia was awarded the '86 World Cup. I think that's something that not everybody knows about. They were awarded the hosting rights for '86, but basically, come the late 70s, early '80s, with the rise of Pablo and the narcos and the violence starting to ramp up, and the government having to spend time and money dealing with that instead of building football stadia and infrastructure to prepare for the World Cup. FIFA were about to take away the hosting rights from Colombia because they deemed the country wasn't ready, the facilities weren't ready, it was probably too dangerous. And so they were taken away and in the end awarded to Mexico. I think a lot of us remember that World Cup fondly. But Colombia weren't in that World Cup. They didn't qualify. They hadn't qualified for a World Cup since 1968, I think, was the first and only time Colombia had been in a World Cup. And it was only 1990 that was the next time they qualified for a World Cup. And in the end, they had three in a row, 90, 94, and 98, having not been in the World Cup for nearly 30 years before that. So you can see that something definitely happened to improve the fortunes of the national team to the point at which that in the early 90s, they were like a top 10 side in the world for quite some time. And I think you do have to link that to the narcos and to Pablo and to their influence on the domestic game. Because what they did was they invested money and energy and attention and resources in the domestic game. And particularly at Atlético Nacional, what Pablo, was part of doing was bringing in Francisco Maturana, who has become one of the most famous coaches in world football. He was brought in, he had very little pedigree when he became the manager of Atlético Nacional, but he had a system and a style of play, and he had a sort of pro-Colombian attitude, and he wanted his side to be filled with Colombians and not expensive imports from Argentina or Chile or Uruguay or anywhere else. So he had a completely Colombian club side, forged in his image of how he wanted to play football. And then he also became the manager of Colombia, and he was able to take a lot of those players and that system and implement it into the Colombia team. And so I think that continuity, that identity across really helped grow Colombian football. And that was made possible because of the money that was put into clubs like Atlético Nacional by the Narcos and by Pablo and others like him. That meant they could pay decent wages, they could retain talent, they could pay the coach decent money, they could have good facilities. And so that money and that ambition built the club sides up, helped develop the Colombian players at those club sides, and then that continuity, I think, particularly with Maturana, who was the manager at Wembley in '88, was the manager at Italia '90, and was the manager at USA '94. I think grew that sort of that golden generation of Colombian football with Valderrama and Higuita and Andres Escobar and the like.
Which other cartels were involved with which club sides?
So Pablo and his Medellin cartel were particularly involved in Atlético Nacional in Medellin, but they also were involved in the other big Medellin club, Deportivo Independiente Medellin, DIM. Then in Bogota, one of the other key members of the Medellin cartel, but who oversaw a lot of the Bogota operations, was Jose González Gacha, known as El Mexicano, and he had an interest in Millonarios, which is a huge club in Bogota, but that had fallen on hard times really for many years, and again saw a massive upswing in their fortunes after he and others with him got involved and began putting money into Millonarios. And then the Cali cartel were invested and part of America de Cali, which was one of the two big clubs in Cali. They were the main ones. There was another smaller club side before them that had been invested in by a group of marijuana cultivators and smugglers. But that didn't really have a big impact on Colombian football scene. But those were the four key sides really: Atlético Nacional and Deportivo Independiente, both in Medellin, Millonarios in Bogota, and America de Cali in Cali. And if you look at the 80s in particular, you can just see, if you look at who won the main competitions in Colombia, it went from being a mixture of a few other sides and a few different winners prior to that, to really it suddenly became those guys slugging it out. And America de Cali went on an incredible run of winning the Colombian League Championship, as it were, several years in a row. I think 5 or maybe even 6 years in a row they won it. But they never managed to win the Copa Libertadores, and they kept trying and kept coming very, very close to winning that competition. And in the end, it was Pablo and Atlético Nacional who were finally able to crack that competition. So I think that was probably it was such a symbolic victory for Pablo over his rivals in Cali. I think that his football team was the one that brought glory to Colombia.
The brought glory, well, he brought glory to Atlético Nacional, especially the league titles initially. But wasn't there rumours of, say, certain threats made against referees or officials, and that could have had as much as a helping hand?
Absolutely. It wasn't just, money and resources that he brought to these sites. And I think perhaps this was unique, maybe not entirely unique, but certainly the suggestion from some around the Cali cartel was that they were prepared to launder their money through these clubs and possibly even invest and kind of enjoy their success when they got it. But they kind of drew the line at doing anything too nefarious for footballing purposes. And that was very much their MO, the Cali cartel. They like to fly under the radar. They like to, keep things quiet and just make as much money as they could through their cocaine empire. Whereas Pablo was big and loud and brash and angry and all kinds of other things that brought attention. And there are definitely multiple recorded instances of him having his men intimidate officials, threaten officials, bribe officials, and ultimately assassinate a referee after a decision went against one of his sides that he didn't like. And like I say, particularly around the 1989 period, that seems to have been rife, and it seems to have been a big part of the Copa Libertadores campaign as well, often orchestrated by his kind of right-hand man, his top sicario, Popeye, and showing Pablo's classic sort of bargaining technique, which was known as plata o plomo, which means silver or lead, effectively money or bullets, take the bribe or die, effectively. And on a lot of occasions, people understandably would take the bribe, and that included officials and referees and other people associated with the game.
Yeah, I mean, with Atletico Nacional, obviously, like I said, they were the first club besides to win a Copa Libertadores. How many attempts had they had before finally winning it?
Off the top of my head, that's a very good question. They'd had a few, and the Colombian sides. In general, the Colombian sides had not done that well in the Copa Libertadores. I mean, the way the competition was set up meant, that there often almost always were Colombian sides in the competition, but traditionally they'd not done well. They'd never won it. I think between them they got to a couple of finals, and then America de Cali went on a run and got very close a couple of times. But Atletico Nacional, certainly before Pablo, weren't really on the radar. I don't think the competition was basically dominated by Argentinian, Brazilian, and Uruguayan teams, effectively, and most of the other club sides from the other countries were sort of also rans most of the time, I think.
Yeah, I know. Obviously, I've heard of a Copa Libertadores before for many years, but isn't there like another continental competition below that, like their equivalent of the Europa League? Is it the Copa Sud? I can't remember the
Yeah,
name.
is it the Copa Sudamericana? I think. Yeah, yeah. So there's a kind of Europa League equivalent, and in my book that becomes a small part of the story later on, when there's a tragic plane crash that leads to that championship game, that final game, having to be cancelled, and one of the Colombian sides dedicating and giving that cup to their rivals who perished in the plane crash. So yeah, there's a kind of second tier tournament. So one of the hardest things, and I tried to keep it very simple in the book so that people could follow, and it didn't get too bogged down in some of the technical detail. But those South American, both the national championships, the sort of league championships, and also the cups, are very complicated systems of how they play out, and they're quite different to the structures that we have here in terms of the league and the cup, the way they're organized. So it can all get quite complicated. They have often, and they've changed over the years as well. At different periods, they've changed the way that the cups and the leagues are played. So it is all quite complicated. But I think certainly from a Western perspective, that second tier cup doesn't get a lot of airtime, as it were. But there is a secondary cup, yeah.
Yeah. So when did Colombia first win the Copa America? Was it like 89? Was it, or was it later?
The Colombia have only, I'll probably get corrected if I've got this wrong, but Colombia, I think, have only won the Copa America once, which was 2001, which was when they hosted the tournament. And actually, again, unfortunately, a tiny bit like the 1989 Copa Libertadores, there's almost like a little asterisk against that victory. I'm sure no Colombian, born and raised in the country, will admit to that, probably. But it was a tournament which almost didn't happen. Again, there were security issues. One of the senior officials in Colombian football was kidnapped just before the tournament was due to begin. And this is even in 2001. This is many years after the death of Pablo, but still with issues with armed groups in Colombia. And so the tournament was postponed and about to be called off, and they managed to get this guy back from his kidnappers, and the country kind of agreed to a ceasefire, and the tournament was allowed to go ahead. But by that point, at least one major side, Argentina, had pulled out because of security concerns. So the countries taking part were not all of the typical countries of a Copa America. I think it was Canada were brought in to replace Argentina from memory. Forgive the fact that I can't recall all of this off the top of my head. But Colombia did go ahead and win that tournament. I think they didn't concede a goal in the entire tournament. Won it. It was a home tournament, but they had amazing support. The ceasefire did hold, and I think the one of the winning goals, or the winning goal in the final, was scored by their defender and captain Ivan Cordoba, who was one of the top players in the side at the time. I think he was playing for Inter Milan in Italy at the time. So it was a great moment for Colombia to be able to host the tournament after all, and then to win it in such fashion. But I think people might point to the fact that Argentina weren't there to say, well, was it a full strength Copa America? And that, I think that remains the only time they've won it. And unfortunately, I stayed up very late the other night to watch them play Argentina in the final of the Copa America this time. And I thought there was a chance they could have done it this year. They played brilliantly in this year's Copa America, and I thought it could have been number two. But in the end, Argentina just too strong, too much strength in depth, I think.
Bear in mind, they've had a club win a Copa Libertadores. They actually came to Wembley and drew 1-1. What were the expectations going into the Italian 90 for Colombia? Were one of the favourites, or did it get to nothing?
No, I think Italia 90, they were definitely an unknown quantity. I think, Copa Libertadores win in 89 was big for Colombia, but probably wasn't widely reported in the Western press at all. The 88 draw at the Rouse Cup against England, it was a small, almost friendly tournament, really. I think the people that did watch that game, there weren't as many as there might have been impressed. I think Colombia played really good football and were unlucky not to win that game. And you could see the quality of players like Valderrama. But I think for most people, they didn't really know much about Colombian football at all. And so Colombia coming into Italia 90, I don't think anyone was thinking much about them. They hadn't been in a World Cup for 28 or 30 years or so. And I think in their previous World Cup in '68, I think they got their first ever point. They got a draw. Was the only point they'd ever got at a World Cup. So I think nobody expected very much. I think they probably outperformed and won some new fans for their style of football, for some of their players, and for their support. The colourful musical support that Colombia get wherever they play. I think that was suddenly, brought to a wider world and a wider audience. And so I think they did, they did really well in that World Cup in putting Colombian football on the global stage and on the map a little bit. And, scoring so late to equalise against West Germany was a huge result for Colombia. To draw with such a strong West German side was a great result. And then to come so close to beating Cameroon, losing in extra time to Roger Mia's goals. They came, it was the first time they'd got to the knockout stages of a World Cup. It's the first time they'd won games at a World Cup, and they very nearly got through to, I think that would have been the quarterfinals if they'd beaten Cameroon. So I think that was a good platform, and then they were able to build on that coming up to the '94 World Cup.
I remember the highlights of that. I was 9 at the time when that World Cup took place. And I remember that Cameroon-Colombia game because of a mistake, especially for a second goal by Rene Higuita. And Higuita's a very interesting character. You draw, especially towards the end of the book, you talk about him a lot. Wasn't he actually friends with Pablo Escobar? And how did that influence the Colombian national team?
Yeah, I mean, I think, he's been more or less outspoken on how personal his relationship with Pablo was, but there's definitely, a strong link between them over many, many years. He was a revolutionary style of goalkeeper. He really invented that sweeper keeper idea, played so far out of his goal. I think he scored 40 career goals as well. He was a penalty taker, but he also scored direct free kicks. He was a real maverick and a brilliant character. And sometimes it came back to bite him, as in that Roger Milla example, when he lost the ball, 40 yards from his own goal. But the way he played enabled the team to play a completely different style and structure, because he was that sweeper. They could play so much higher and with different personnel. And that was a key part of Maturana's, strategy, I think, both at club level. Higuita played for Atlético Nacional, crucial player for Atlético Nacional, but also for the national team. But yes, he was a Medellin, boy, born and bred, and he grew up, kind of under the auspices of Pablo, really. I did read in a few places that Pablo might even have been the one who identified him, as a talent playing on the pitches that he may or may not have built, and kind of helped get him into the team. And I think Higuita was initially playing as a forward or some kind of outfield player, and then converted to a goalkeeper a little bit later, as a young man, as a boy. But yes, they seem to have had this ongoing relationship, and it kind of all came to a head. There are a couple of instances really where it was crucial to both of them and to football. One was in the very early 1990s when Pablo was in his self-built, self-designed prison, La Catedral, in the hills outside Medellin. And he was living the life of Riley, really, there. And he was hosting football matches, and he was smuggling people in to party with him and to play football with him. Everyone from Maradona to the players of his club sides and the national team. And he definitely got more than one visit, I think, from René Higuita, both as a player and as a visitor. And on one of those occasions, the kind of press pack that often gathered at the sort of gates a few miles from the compound spotted Higuita. I think he had to change vehicles in order to get up to the prison to see Pablo, and he sort of waved to them, but they got it all on camera. And I think that was one of the moments where this sort of convenient lie that Pablo was in prison and the Colombian authorities had got their man was exposed to the Colombian populace, that actually Pablo was acting with impunity. He might be behind bars, but he was having famous visitors, and he was, to all intents and purposes, still just running his empire quite easily from behind bars. So he was in this kind of gilded cage, and that visit of Higuita, I think, made the press and the public kind of sit up and go, come on, this isn't really on. He's not being punished. He's just, he's kind of under house arrest, really. So that basically led to their attempt to clamp down on his situation, which, when the authorities went to visit, he heard they were going to come to visit him. He escaped from the prison, and he ended up being on the run for about 18 months or so after that. So that visit from Higuita to him was a key moment, I think, in his story. And then equally, in 1993, kidnappings were very, very common in Colombia. Kidnappings for money happened an awful lot. And a young girl was kidnapped. She was the daughter of a wealthy, important man in Medellin, and he was a friend of Atlético Nacional. And somehow Higuita was roped into being the sort of middleman to broker the return of this girl. And he was able to do that. The ransom was paid, which was, if not illegal, then frowned upon, but I think heavily illegal at that time. I think the authorities did not want to encourage kidnapping, and so made paying ransoms illegal. But the ransom was paid. The girl was brought back, and Higuita got her, as it were. He went and handed over the cash and brought the girl back to her family, which should have been a happy ending, I guess. But one version of the story, and as with many of these stories, there are more than one version depending on who you listen to. But one version of the story is that Higuita was invited to a party hosted by the parents, the relieved parents of this young girl. And he almost didn't go, but at the last minute he went just to kind of say hi because he thought it would be rude not to accept their thanks. And they insisted on giving him money to say thank you. And he didn't feel comfortable refusing it, so he accepted it. And that gave the authorities enough opportunity to prosecute him for effectively financially benefiting from the kidnapping, even though he wasn't the kidnapper and he wasn't benefiting from the fee that was paid to them. But a lot of people in Colombia, some journalists included, very much felt that that was the authorities trying to get back at Pablo. And as soon as Higuita was arrested and imprisoned, all they seemed to want to talk to him about was, do you know where Pablo is? He was on the run at this point. He was hiding out. They've been trying to catch him for over a year. And so it was viewed as a way to put the screws on Higuita to try to get him to give up Pablo, which he refused to do. But that meant that he was in prison for many months. And when he came out, he wasn't really able to reintegrate into the national team. And so he didn't go to the 94 World Cup, really as a result of his imprisonment, which again is, it's a story that Colombians know a lot about. But I think a lot of these stories, the wider world, the Western world, the European and North American readers, the British readers probably don't know an awful lot about. And I think I wrote this book because I wanted people to understand, and for myself to understand, really, for example, that 94 World Cup, how that went so wrong and why that went so wrong. The players weren't bad players. They were one of the best teams in the world. They just beaten Argentina 5-0 in Buenos Aires. But a whole host of other things happened. And, how can you imagine going to a World Cup and trying to perform under the pressure of the situations that they were under that I talk about in the book?
Yeah, I was going to come to that 94 World Cup because obviously at the time I'd heard about Andres Escobar and he was going to own goal, and a few days later paying for it with his life. But going into that World Cup, Colombia were one of the favourites to actually win it. It actually changed from 4 years ago where they went from unknown to wanting to win it. And part of the catalyst for that was the year before when they beat Argentina 5-0. Can you just first of all briefly talk about that 5-0 win and what it meant for the national side? And then also the tragedy of that World Cup, because yes, a death happened at the end of it, but there was a whole lead up as well.
Yeah, this, I think I'm a similar age to you, Chris. And so I was, I must have been 14 coming on 15 when it was the 94 World Cup, football mad teenager in South London. England weren't in that World Cup. So I was 100% Colombian for that World Cup. We had massive Colombia flags hanging from our house. And that failure, I think, was sort of a very small in the grand scheme of things, but a sort of trauma in my childhood of what happened there. And the book was me trying to come to terms with that, I think. And I think you're right. It all started with qualification for the World Cup. Qualified in 1990 for the first time in years. That was a big deal. Qualification for 94 was very different. Going into the final game of South American qualifying, Colombia had to travel to Buenos Aires to play Argentina, who were, on a great run of form, almost unbeatable at home. But Colombia were also on a really good run of form, and Colombia were actually, I think Colombia were top and Argentina were second in qualifying. And because of the way qualifying was divided up that tournament, it meant that Argentina had to win at home in this final game in order to guarantee qualification for USA 94. Colombia, a win or a draw would guarantee them qualification. Whoever didn't get the result that they were looking for would have to go into a playoff, I think, against the Oceania side, basically, winners of the Oceania qualification. So it was a real last game, everything to play for. Argentina had to win, but they were at home in front of tens of thousands of fans. And Colombia went to Buenos Aires. They were sort of heckled and barracked from the moment they stepped off the plane. But it's a sort of a footballing miracle that is still celebrated in Colombia today. It's still kind of viewed almost as the pinnacle of Colombian football. They just sort of systematically took Argentina apart, really. They went ahead, then they went 2 goals ahead. The camera kind of cuts to Maradona in the stands in his Argentina shirt, head in hands, as he sees it all kind of falling apart for Argentina. As Colombia went ahead in the game and Argentina had to push and push and push, the gaps opened up, and in the end it finished 5-0 to Colombia in Buenos Aires. And I think that's when the world sat up and took notice. And one of the best goals in that game was scored by Faustino Asprilla, who I'm sure a lot of listeners will have heard of. Was playing for Parma at the time, went on to play for Newcastle United. I think people suddenly realized if this team could beat Argentina in a must-win game in Buenos Aires 5-0 and win the qualification group, then suddenly they must be in the conversation for being somebody worth considering for the World Cup next year in USA. And so that wave, was what kind of carried the team to USA 94. But unfortunately, I think that game happened late in 93, but there was something like 8 or 9 months before the World Cup the next year. And in that time, Higuita went to prison. And in that time, the team played innumerable friendly games to help the sort of Colombian football earn money. They were playing in all kinds of sponsor organized games. They were doing all kinds of adverts and other media engagements. And so I think they were not prepared as they could have been going into that World Cup. And so they were viewed very highly, but they maybe had not had the preparation that they needed in the end. But that on its own, perhaps wouldn't have made a huge difference. But then the other factors that came into play when they were in America that really just sunk their campaign from the get-go. One of the key ones was, my understanding of it, and it's how I try to explain it in the book, was Pablo died in December 1993. And so by the summer of 94, there was this sort of ongoing struggle for power and power vacuum created by his death and the kind of dissolving of the Medellin cartel, how the Cali cartel were trying to, make sure that they had full control. And against that backdrop, and with the players representing Colombia coming from some of those crucial teams, and with the history of the narcos gambling heavily and being heavily involved in what happened in football, there was a huge amount of pressure put on Maturana and his coaches in terms of team selection. And there were certain decisions that they were threatened, and the lives of the families of the players and the coaches were threatened if they didn't do what they were being told to do. And one of those decisions was to drop a key midfielder. And another interesting thing that seemed to happen was the selection of the strikers for Colombia didn't always seem to make sense to the outsider. And I suspect that there were, that was something to do with the pressure that was being put on the coaching side by the cartels. And you can actually see it if you watch back those games on YouTube now, and you see the Colombia players coming out and then standing and singing the national anthem. With hindsight, you can see it. You can see they don't look happy. They don't look excited. They look terrified. They look exhausted. Their eyes are kind of sunken and sad and dark. And I don't think it's reading too much into it to look at that and know that terrible things were happening behind the scenes, really. So they were being threatened. Their families were being threatened. Team selection was being affected as a result. And then it kind of all just went wrong from there. And the performances on the pitch were patchy. But you could see that in the moments where it went wrong and where it counted, it weighed so much more heavily on them, I think, because this was life and death for them in a way that it just wasn't for the other teams and the other players. And you can see it when Andres Escobar scores his own goal. You know, you can see that the fear and the kind of haunted nature of the looks for him and his teammates. So yeah, there were hugely unlucky moments. There were moments of hope. There were terrible, goals conceded, brilliant and lucky goals conceded. But in the end, it was too little, too late. They lost to Romania, a goal from Hadji from practically, the touch line. That I would say is a mishit cross, but I'm sure everybody else will say is a wonder goal, catching the keeper off his line. The keeper who was the stand-in for Higuita and had done brilliantly in Buenos Aires, but in America looked a bag of nerves. And again, you can only think that is partly influenced by what's going on behind the scenes. And so they lost to Romania, and then the huge one was losing to America. The kind of the enemy in many ways, the country that was threatening to extradite Colombian citizens for the last 10, 15, 20 years, and a team that Colombia had beaten several times and was expected to beat, and then to lose with that Andres Escobar own goal was really that was the end of the campaign, that second game. And in the third game, Colombia won, but it was too little, too late. They needed results in the other game to go their way, and they didn't, and they were eliminated. And as we know, and as I explain in the book, that led to the death of Andres Escobar.
The '98 World Cup, I remember with Colombia because they played England and they lost. That was a winner-takes-all game from who got out of that group. I think Colombia were 2-0 down at half time, and England were the better side, especially in our first half. What's happened since Paolo's death? Obviously, had the World Cup, but what's happened since then in terms of development of Colombian football? I know they won the Copa America in 2001, although, like you say, there's asterisks by that. So, how have the national team done, and how their, especially the club sides, have they done since all this has happened?
Yeah, I mean, so really following the death of Pablo, that was kind of the start of the decline, really, of the club sides and the national side. And there are some exceptions to that, and that's not to say there weren't some really good players and managers and other things, but it was certainly the decline in the money started. Pablo really was at the forefront of putting money into football, I think, from the Narcos side. When he was gone, by that point, El Mexicano was also dead. The Cali cartel always liked to fly under the radar a bit more. And I think the cartels and those associated with them started to see football as not the best way to launder their money, and certainly not a worthwhile investment of their money. So the money started to flood out of the game, the domestic game at that point, really. So by '98, that '94 generation, for my lifetime, I think of as the golden generation. There was an early 1950s moment in Colombian football where that was viewed as being the first golden era of Colombian football. But that was to do with foreign players being able to be attracted to come and play in Colombia. That '94 generation, by '98, the national team was weaker. The club sides, had weakened. And they were a sort of pale imitation, really, of the team that should have done so well at USA '94. Valderrama was still there, but I think by '98 he was something like 36. He could still pick a pass, but the legs had really gone, I think, by that point. We still had Faustino Asprilla, but I think during that tournament he fell out with the manager, which, if I remember correctly, was the guy who grew up as Pacho Maturana's number 2, known as El Bolillo. And I think he was a manager in '98, and he fell out with Asprilla, and Asprilla was sent home. And he was really one of the only form world-class players in the squad. And so it was just some young players, some untried players, some maybe not quite good enough players, an aging Valderrama, Asprilla sent out of the squad. So yeah, it was disappointing because having expected so much in '94, got that second chance in '98, and it just never really happened. And like you say, England beat them quite comfortably. Colombia didn't really threaten. I think it was it Darren Anderton and a David Beckham free kick or something. I think, yeah, classic Beckham free kick. Um, and yeah, Colombia didn't really threaten. I think they scored one goal in that tournament, and it was scored by a young substitute striker called Leyder Preciado, who was one of those kind of fringe players who never really, reached the heights of someone like Asprilla. So yeah, that was not a great campaign for Colombia, and kind of emblematic of the decline of football in the country.
Yeah. So, how just to quickly sum up, how would you describe Pablo's legacy when it comes to Colombian football?
Gosh, that's a difficult one, isn't it? I mean, I think it's a double-edged sword, and everything with Pablo, comes with huge, huge caveats and negatives. I was very torn writing this book about, the idea of not wanting to go back over old ground. And, there's been so much written and said about Pablo, and I didn't want this to be just another story about Pablo. What I really wanted this to be was a story about Colombian football, but explaining that is inextricably linked to Pablo and the cartels and what they were doing. And that is a negative and a positive. He bribed people, he intimidated people around football, including referees. He had a referee killed. He killed hundreds, thousands of Colombians, from innocent, people and policemen to politicians to all kinds of people that he had assassinated, killed, blown up in passenger planes. He perpetrated horrific atrocities and brought the country, to war. But he did develop the game. He put money into the game. He built pitches. He helped clubs identify and retain players. He gave Maturana an opportunity to become a world-class coach. Without him, would Atletico Nacional have won the Copa Libertadores? I'm sure they wouldn't. Would Colombia have been such a strong side in the early 1990s? I think a lot of it comes down to Maturana and Atletico Nacional, but how much you can separate that from Pablo, I think it's hard to say that he had no impact on that. So, and then you look at the decline after his death and after the other narcos start to take their money and their influence out of the game. And you can only say that, money and ambition can do a lot for football. And we see that today. And, I think that's one of the interesting things about the book is the parallels you can, if you so wish, draw to what is happening in football today in terms of who is putting money into football, why they're putting money into football, and the impact that's having on the success of various club sides. Less so with national sides maybe today because it's so international. Whereas Atletico Nacional and Maturana, put Colombian players first and use that money to develop Colombian footballers, really. But yeah, I think he was an integral and sort of inextricable part of that rise of Colombian football, but it came at a huge cost, and it also caused a sort of an equally rapid decline, really.
It's a fascinating read. I really enjoyed going through it. Just quickly then, if people want to buy your book, where can I get it from?
So the book's available everywhere that you can get hold of your books. It's available in hardback, ebook, and a really great audiobook edition as well, read by one of the top audiobook narrators in the world. So yeah, they can get it everywhere. It's online, it's in all good bookshops. And yeah, it's available in 3 editions. I think the paperback is not out till summer next year. So if you're looking for a read for the summer holidays, for the beach or the pool, If you like football, if you're interested in Narcos, if you watch Griselda, if you are interested in history, biography, or anything to do with South America, I think you might enjoy it.
Well, thank you so much for coming on to the 286 project, and all the best with success of your book.
Thanks so much, Chris. Really appreciated talking to you.
Thank you.